A police officer on night patrol heard something strange near the abandoned gas station. Not a scream, but the sound of fire, fur, and betrayal. When he ran toward the flames, what he found would haunt him forever. A German shepherd, burning, and still wagging his tail. What came next will challenge everything you thought you knew about forgiveness, loyalty, and second chances. But before we begin, tell me, have you ever had a dog who changed your life? Drop their name in the comments. Let's remember the ones who stayed beside us, even when the world didn't. And if you believe no dog should ever be left behind, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness might just restore your faith in love and in people. The wind cut through Ash Creek like a blade that never dulled. Snow, dry and sharp, swept sideways under the pale eye of the winter moon. It was midnight in Montana, a time when silence wrapped the town in suspicion and frost, and not even porch lights dared to flicker. Ash Creek was a place of long memories and short welcomes, especially for outsiders, and Luke Morgan, despite the badge pinned above his heart, was still an outsider. New to town, newly transferred, and still carrying the weight of wars no one here had witnessed, Luke patrolled the snow-covered backroads in a department-issued cruiser. The heater groaned, barely enough to fight the freeze outside, and country radio crackled like ghosts from another life. Then came the sound. A pop, then a roar, and then a scream, but not human. Luke's spine straightened. His boot crushed the gas pedal, tires groaning over packed snow as the cruiser veered off Route 17 toward the old Sinclair gas station. It had been shuttered for years, paint flaking, windows boarded. No one was supposed to be here. But fire had a way of rewriting rules. As he pulled closer, flames licked the edge of the structure's loading dock. Something small, wrapped in flickering orange, thrashed against the ground. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and something worse, burning fur. Luke slammed the door and ran. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, just moved. Through the blur of snow and smoke, he saw it. A dog. German shepherd. Muzzle low, eyes wide with terror. Its body was bound in rope, soaked in what smelled like gasoline, and the fire, God, the fire, it had caught along its flank and tail. Above the roar, there was another sound. A rustle. Fast. Human. Luke turned, caught the silhouette of someone darting into the trees, coat flapping, face hidden. But there was no time to give chase, not with a life burning alive at his feet. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, ripping his jacket off and slamming it over the flames. His hands found snow, packed it tight, pressed it against the fur. The dog cried out, not with teeth, but with desperation. Not attacking, just begging. Smoke clawed at Luke's lungs, made his eyes sting. But he stayed, even as his fingers blistered, even as the jacket singed. When the last ember died, the air turned sickeningly quiet. The dog was still breathing, barely. Its eyes, amber and wet, locked on his. There was no hate in them, just confusion and pain, and something that cracked straight through Luke's armor. Trust. "Hang in there," he whispered, lifting the dog gently into his arms. Its body was heavier than it looked, muscle gone thin from neglect, fur singed in brutal patches, one leg trembling uncontrollably. But it didn't fight. It just leaned. Luke staggered back toward the cruiser, snow crunching beneath his boots. Behind him, the station's dock crackled faintly, and the tree line swallowed the last trace of the fleeing figure. Sirens in the distance, reinforcements coming. But for now, it was just him and the dog. Luke eased into the back seat, letting the heater blast against the dog's shivering body. He wrapped the emergency blanket around them both, one arm still cradling the creature like a wounded child. The dog shifted slightly, and for the first time its tail moved. Just once. A weak, deliberate wag. Luke blinked hard. Outside, snow had begun to fall in earnest, blanketing the ruined ground in pale absolution. He didn't know the dog's name, didn't know the story behind the fire, but something inside him, Something that had been numb since his last tour, since the last flag he folded, was starting to flicker. He looked down at the dog again. "You held on," he murmured. "So I will too." And in that moment, beneath the falling snow, with sirens drawing near and ash still clinging to his coat, Luke Morgan made a silent vow. Whatever this was, it wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The wind howled down from the Absaroka Range, dragging icy fingers through the pines that lined the eastern edge of Ash Creek, Montana. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but the faintest hue of silver stretched low across the horizon, bleeding into the night like a wound. Snowflakes flickered in the cruiser's headlights as Officer Luke Morgan pulled into the gravel lot behind a barn-shaped clinic perched at the outskirts of town. The air was brittle with frost, the temperature hovering below 20 degrees, and the breath in his chest seemed to burn from the cold, or perhaps from what he carried in his arms. The German shepherd was wrapped in his uniform jacket, soaked in the stench of gasoline and scorched fur. The blanket Luke had used to smother the fire was half melted to the dog's side, and yet, somehow, the animal still breathed. Shallow, rasping, but steady. Its eyes were closed, but every few seconds its ears flicked in response to a sound or movement. He hadn't named it yet, but something inside him had already whispered the word Blaze. The door to the clinic opened before he could knock. A woman stepped out, her figure silhouetted against the fluorescent lights inside. Dr. Melody Carter stood just under 6 feet, wiry and weathered like someone who'd lived through more than her share of storms. Her hair, long and streaked with silver, was pulled back into a tight braid. Her face was angular, cheekbones sharp, jaw defined, and her expression was a masterclass in restrained urgency. She wore navy scrubs and an olive-green thermal overtop, sleeves pushed to the elbow, revealing lean forearms that bore faint burn scars. She had the presence of someone who once commanded triage tents in desert war zones and still hadn't quite come home. "Bring him in," she said, voice low but steady. No wasted time on introductions. Luke followed her through the wide double doors into the warmth of the clinic. The space smelled of antiseptic and hay. Melody had converted this place from an old horse barn, wood beams lined the ceilings, and a potbelly stove glowed in the corner. The exam table was steel and spotless, under a surgical light humming quietly. Luke laid Blaze down gently. The dog whimpered, a noise so faint it might have been missed by anyone else, but Melody heard it. She was already slipping on gloves. "What happened?" she asked, eyes narrowing as she assessed the damage. "Gasoline," Luke said. "Someone poured it on him, lit a match. I caught the tail end of it. Couldn't catch the guy." Melody didn't curse, didn't shake her head. She just started working. She clipped the fur back from the worst burns, exposing blistered skin the color of raw muscle. Her hands moved with practiced speed. Syringes, IV bags, burn cream, saline wash. 60% burn coverage, she muttered, more to herself than to Luke. Back legs, lower torso, 3rd degree in multiple zones. The fact that he's conscious is unexpected. Luke stood by uselessly, fists clenched, watching blood drip from the dog's hindquarters onto the table. "His eyes," Luke whispered. "Before I got him out, he looked at me, like he knew." Melody didn't look up. These dogs always know. Her voice softened when her fingers reached behind the shepherd's left ear. She paused. "What is it?" Luke asked. "There's something here." She brushed gently, then used a saline pad to clean the area. As the soot lifted, a faint tattoo emerged. Blurry, but unmistakable. Letters and numbers, military style. "K9 Unit, U.S. Army," Melody said. Her tone changed. Not surprise, but recognition. Luke exhaled slowly, as if the breath had been waiting to leave since the fire. "He's a soldier." "Yes," Melody replied, reaching for a scanner, "and we're going to do everything we can to save him." Luke pulled a metal stool closer and sat beside the table. Blaze's chest rose and fell in shallow waves. His face was lined with soot and caked blood, but his ears still responded to the sound of Melody's voice. The dog's age was hard to tell under the damage, probably around 7, but the wear of war could age even the strongest animal faster than time. Melody ran the chip scanner slowly over his shoulder blades. A soft beep. The screen lit up. "ID confirmed," she said. "Name, Alpha 77. Handler, Sergeant Thomas Rayburn." Luke blinked. That name sounded familiar, like a whisper from a past he hadn't fully faced. He stood and walked to the clinic's window, staring out into the snow-dusted woods. Ash Creek looked peaceful from here. White fences, barns half hidden in frost, chimney smoke curling into dawn. A town that didn't know how much pain lived on its edges. Behind him, Melody continued cleaning Blaze's wounds. The dog jerked slightly, and Luke flinched as if he felt it himself. "Do you need help?" he asked. "No," Melody replied, then hesitated. "But he might." Luke turned. "What do you mean?" "Dogs like this. They survive things most humans can't, but they carry it. Burn trauma, yes, but also trauma from the field. If he was retired and ended up in the wrong hands, it means someone lost him, or abandoned him. Either way, he's been through hell." Luke nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to say it. He was thinking about Bear. Bear had been 4 when he died. Jet black fur, amber eyes like firelight, and loyalty that never wavered, even in his final moment. He'd thrown himself between Luke and a shotgun blast during a drug raid outside Minneapolis. Luke hadn't even seen the threat. Bear had. They gave him a burial with honors, folded a flag, said some words. But it wasn't enough. Luke had lived. Bear hadn't. And now this dog, Blaze, was burning in his arms like fate had looped back around. "You okay?" Melody asked gently. Luke nodded. "Just thinking about someone." Melody glanced at him, eyes softened. "Me too." They fell into silence, both occupied with ghosts. The monitor beeped steadily. Blaze's heart rate, though slow, was steady. Finally, Melody took off her gloves, her fingers trembling slightly. She ran a hand down Blaze's neck, her touch barely a whisper. "He's stable, for now," she said. "But the next 48 hours are critical." Luke crouched next to the table and rested a hand on Blaze's paw. It was large, scorched on the edges, but still strong. "You're not done," he whispered. "Not yet." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the loose tin on the old barn roof. Snow began to fall harder, tapping the window in quiet rhythm, like the steady breath of something ancient trying to remind them that time was moving, that light would eventually come. In a clinic on the edge of nowhere, a burned soldier, 4-legged, nameless, and silent, fought to stay alive. And 2 broken people waited beside him, each carrying pieces of their past stitched deep into muscle and memory. None of them knew what came next, but they knew, without question, they weren't letting go. Not this time. The morning in Ash Creek broke gray and bitter. Snow clung to the roof of the old gas station, now cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered lazily in the wind. The fire had long been extinguished, but the ground still reeked of scorched rubber, fuel, and something more unsettling: betrayal. Officer Luke Morgan stood near the edge of the crime scene, his boots crunching over charred gravel. He scanned the area once more, this time with steadier eyes and the heavy silence of responsibility sitting on his shoulders. Blaze, named only hours earlier in Luke's mind, was recovering at the vet clinic. But the dog's presence still weighed in his chest like unfinished business. Luke knelt beside a burnt patch of grass where the fire had started, gloved fingers sifting through debris. A crushed cigarette butt. Marlboro Reds. Then, just under the blackened remains of a gas can, a small scrap of paper, half charred but legible. He unfolded it with care. Scrawled in hurried block letters, smeared with ash, were 2 words: "Forgive me." Luke's breath caught for a moment. It wasn't the words alone. It was the handwriting. Somehow, it felt hauntingly familiar, like an echo from a voice he'd once heard in chaos. Before he could think further, the sound of a car pulling up broke the stillness. A county forensic tech emerged. A young man named Jesse Rudd, mid-20s, lanky, wearing a black beanie and gray puffer jacket. Jesse had the nervous energy of someone who worked better with machines than people. "Morning, officer," he greeted, his voice cracking slightly from the cold. "Got your call. You said it was urgent?" Luke handed him the scrap of paper and pointed out several partial boot prints nearby. "Military tread, not civilian. I want these analyzed, compared to any known vets in the system living nearby." Jesse nodded, already photographing the prints. "Anything else?" Luke hesitated, then pointed toward a patch of disturbed snow near the woods. "There." He ran that way. "Check for blood. Maybe he didn't leave unscathed." As Jesse got to work, Luke turned back toward his cruiser, his mind turning over the name from the microchip scan Melody had sent him earlier that morning. Alpha 77. Handler, Sergeant Thomas Rayburn. The name scratched at his memories like a dull blade trying to pierce through fog. Back at the station, Luke sat at his desk, a sturdy, government-issued thing covered in files no one had touched in years. Most officers in Ash Creek were older, close to retirement, and didn't bother with military records or databases. Luke, however, had access. Years in federal task forces had left him with more than a badge. He had connections. He logged into a secured military archive using an old credential. Thomas Rayburn's record came up faster than expected. Born 1984. Enlisted at 19. Multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Special Forces designation. Sniper ranking, elite. Commendations for valor. Then, suddenly, injury. Marked classified. Discharged under Section 8, psychological trauma and PTSD. Declared unstable after a failed extraction mission in Kandahar. Vanished from VA records 2 years ago. Then Luke saw it. A report from a mission in Helmand Province, 2017. Ambush. A team pinned down under enemy fire. Intel had misfired. One man crawled through a sniper's nest to return fire. He was assisted by a military K-9 identified as Alpha 77, who disrupted enemy placement by drawing fire, allowing several men to escape. Among them, Corporal Luke Morgan. Luke leaned back in his chair, his heart thudding. His hand reached instinctively for the scar under his collarbone, the one he'd gotten from shrapnel that night. It was Blaze. Blaze had saved his life, and he hadn't even known it. His thoughts were broken by a knock at the door. Melody Carter stepped inside, brushing snow off her boots. She wore a wool coat and had a file folder clutched in her hand. Her expression was more curious than urgent. "He's stable," she said, before Luke could ask. "Blaze, I mean. He has burns, yes, but this dog is different. He doesn't panic under morphine. He breathes through pain. It's like he's trained to endure." Luke nodded slowly. "He is." His handler was Sergeant Thomas Rayburn, Special Forces, discharged unstable. Melody's brow furrowed. "That name sounds familiar." Luke handed her the incident report. "He disappeared 2 years ago. No address, no next of kin, but I think he's here, and I think he's the one who set Blaze on fire." She looked shocked, but not entirely surprised. "So, this dog was with him when—" "When whatever happened, happened," Luke finished. They sat in silence for a moment before Luke pulled a plastic evidence bag from his drawer. Inside was the burnt piece of paper with the words, "Forgive me." "I found this at the scene," he said. "It wasn't just a cruel act. It was something else. A breakdown, maybe. A goodbye." Melody studied the paper. "If Rayburn is here, he's not just dangerous. He's lost. Completely untethered." Luke didn't answer. He looked at the photograph attached to Rayburn's military record, taken 6 years ago. The man had been strong-jawed, eyes sharp but distant, haunted even then. A soldier who had never left the battlefield even when the war ended. "I need to find him," Luke said finally, "not just because of Blaze, but because I owe them both." Melody didn't ask why, Maybe she understood better than most that some debts couldn't be measured in money or medals, only in the lengths one was willing to go for redemption. As she left, the snow began falling again, heavier now, blanketing Ash Creek in a fresh coat of silence. Luke stared out the window. Somewhere in those woods, a ghost from the war was walking among them, and Blaze, burned, scarred, and still breathing, had been the only one to find him. The Ash Creek Police Department sat like a relic from a bygone era. Wood-paneled walls, humming radiators, and file cabinets that groaned when opened. In one of the back offices, Officer Luke Morgan sat hunched over a monitor, eyes glued to grainy footage flickering in black and white. The timestamp read 2 nights ago. The location, the abandoned gas station. What played out on screen wasn't a crime. It was a tragedy. Blaze came into frame first, limping slightly, his gait still firm despite the harsh Montana night. He moved with purpose, not fear, ears perked, tail wagging gently. He wasn't running from danger. He was approaching someone he knew. Then came the figure. Thomas Rayburn stepped out from the shadows, his face partially obscured by a hood and beard, but the way he moved, rigid yet unstable, was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, but stooped like a man carrying more than his own weight. Blaze stopped a few feet away and sat, ears back, wagging tail low. Submission. Recognition. A memory passed between them without a word. And then the unthinkable. Thomas raised a red gas can. With shaking hands, he poured the liquid over Blaze. The dog didn't move. He didn't whimper. He looked up at Thomas with eyes filled not with fear, but something worse. Trust. And, in the next frame, a burst of light as the flame ignited. Luke slammed the monitor off, the room suddenly too small, too hot. His stomach twisted. The image of Blaze sitting still in fire's embrace wouldn't leave him. That trust shattered. The door creaked open, and Melody Carter entered, her face pale and drawn. She had traded her usual ponytail for a messy bun and wore an oversized parka with a faded military patch on the sleeve. Army Medical Corps. Her eyes darted to the dark monitor. "You saw it, didn't you?" Luke nodded slowly. He didn't fight back. He knew him, and still stayed. Melody sat down across from him, clutching a paper coffee cup with hands that trembled more than the steam rising from it. "It's not the worst thing he's done," she said quietly, "but it might be the most painful." Luke looked up. "You knew Thomas?" She hesitated. "No, but my fiancé did. His name was Jared Monroe. They served together, same unit, same barracks. Jared came home early, left with an honorable discharge, but he was different. Couldn't sleep, couldn't stand crowds, would flinch if the toaster popped too loud. What happened?" Luke asked, though he could already guess. Melody stared into her cup. "He shot himself in our garage, 2 years ago, this week." Silence settled like snowfall between them. Then she added, "He left a note. Said the only one who ever understood him was Thomas." Luke leaned back, absorbing the weight of it all. That explains the dog. Why Blaze went to him. "He wasn't just a pet," Melody said. "Blaze was their constant. Through the blood, the sand, the noise. When Thomas broke, maybe Blaze was the last thread holding him together. And when that snapped," Luke began. "He burned it," she finished. They sat in the quiet office, the hum of the radiator ticking like a metronome. Luke felt a storm gathering inside, not rage, not even pity, but something far heavier, conflict. The man who'd saved lives was now the one setting his own salvation on fire. "I pulled the boot print match from Jesse," Luke said, changing the subject. "Confirmed military issue. Thomas is definitely here. Maybe hiding in the outskirts, maybe closer, but he's here." Melody nodded. "And Blaze?" "Resting. Sedated," Luke replied. "But even after all that, he still wags his tail when I say Thomas's name." "That's the cruelest part," Melody whispered. "He still believes." Luke stood, grabbing his coat. "I have to find him, before he disappears again. Or worse." Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, light at first, but steady. Luke walked toward his cruiser, passing Officer Nolan, an older man with a gray mustache and limp from an old skiing accident. Nolan nodded politely but didn't ask questions. Like most in Ash Creek, he preferred his truths muted and private. Luke didn't blame him. Some stories were too heavy to share. At the edge of the woods, Luke stood still, wind cutting through the pines. Somewhere beyond, Thomas was out there, a man torn between hero and hazard, past and present. And Blaze, burned and broken, still wagged his tail at the mention of him. A part of Luke, a part forged in foreign war zones and firefights, understood. You didn't abandon your brother in arms, even when they'd lost themselves. But you didn't let them keep hurting others either. The line between duty and mercy was growing thinner by the hour, and somewhere in the snow, a man watched from the tree line. The snow had thickened overnight, blanketing Ash Creek in a stillness so dense even the wind seemed hesitant to stir. Officer Luke Morgan sat in his patrol car parked outside the station, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching steam curl from the cup like ghostly fingers. The engine hummed low, windshield half fogged, his thoughts tangled in the silence. The call came in just after 7 o'clock a.m. A static-laced voice crackled over dispatch, barely distinguishable through interference. "Officer Morgan, this is Thomas Rayburn." Luke's coffee froze mid-air. "I don't have much time. I'm at a phone booth across from the old VA hospital outside town. You need to hear this." Luke hit the ignition, his pulse thudding louder than the engine. Within minutes, he tore down the icy backroads, the town waking sluggishly behind him. A single street lamp flickered near the crumbling remains of the VA clinic, shuttered years ago, windows boarded, ivy gripping brick like veins. Beside it, a weathered phone booth leaned awkwardly, almost sunken into snow. Luke stepped out cautiously, hand on his holster. The receiver hung from the booth by its coiled cord, swinging gently in the wind. No one was there. He brought the handset to his ear. It was still warm. The voice returned, recorded on a voicemail Thomas had left at dispatch. "I wasn't trying to hurt him, Luke," Thomas said. "I was trying to disappear." In the voicemail, Thomas's voice carried a tremor that came from somewhere deeper than fear. "I came out here with one goal: end it. The fire, the gas can, Blaze found me first. I don't know how, just appeared out of the trees like he always used to back then. I froze. God, Luke, I couldn't do it. He was wagging his tail wagging like he forgave me already." Luke closed his eyes, the image too real. "I tried to push him away, but he kept coming back. I yelled at him, shoved him, and when I swung the can to scare him, it sloshed over, got on him. I dropped the lighter. It wasn't supposed to go like that." Thomas's voice cracked. "He yelped. That sound. I tried to smother it, tried to roll him in the snow, but he ran. And I couldn't follow. I didn't deserve to." The message ended in silence. Luke stood there a moment longer, the line buzzing in his ear. At the station, Melody Carter was already waiting. She had dark circles under her eyes and wore her old military jacket again, an armor of memory more than warmth. In her hand was a folded, yellowed page. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed it over. "I found this while going through Jared's storage box," she said. "It's the last thing he wrote before it happened." Luke unfolded the note. The handwriting was tight and angular. It read, "I don't know how much longer I can pretend I'm okay, but Thomas, he still fights, even when his mind turns on him. He sees things I don't, hears ghosts, but he keeps trying. He's the last one of us still holding on to something human. If he ever falls, we all will." Luke lowered the paper slowly. "So even Jared knew," he whispered. "Thomas was the thread." Melody nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "But even threads fray." Luke's eyes hardened. He didn't run away from the fire. He caused it, yes, but not out of malice, out of madness, out of being left behind. They stood in silence for a long beat. the kind that only exists between people who've both seen war in different forms. Later that day, Luke drove back to the VA hospital. He searched the surrounding woods, finding faint boot prints leading away from the phone booth. Not deep enough for someone carrying supplies, just one man walking without a plan, a ghost in motion. He followed the trail until it disappeared into a gully filled with ice-covered leaves. But there, on a broken bench half buried in snow, lay something small, a single Army dog tag. It wasn't Blaze's. It was Thomas Rayburn's. Luke turned it over. On the back, scratched faintly into the metal, were the same two words he'd seen before. Forgive me. The morning air in Ash Creek was unusually still, as if the town itself held its breath. Snow had frozen into crusty sheets over sidewalks and rooftops, painting the small Montana town in bleached silence. But the quiet would not last. Thomas Rayburn stepped off the sheriff's cruiser with his wrists bound, his coat frayed at the seams, hood pulled low over unkempt brown hair flecked with ash. His beard was overgrown, cheeks sunken, eyes shadowed and downcast. A soldier undone. The kind of man who once held fire in his hands to protect others, and now had returned with the memory of that fire seared into his soul. Sheriff Benjamin Locke, a barrel-chested man in his early 60s with thick silver hair and a cowboy's jawline, met Luke at the station steps. "You sure about this?" Locke asked, voice tight. "Bringing him back here? Half the town wants his head, the other half wants him gone." Luke, still wearing his snow-dusted patrol jacket and a haunted look, nodded once. "I'm not asking for sympathy, just due process, and a chance for him to heal." Inside the station, the murmurs had already begun. Townspeople had gathered outside, holding signs, shouting words that stung harder than snow against skin. "Burn the monster! He's not one of us. Send him back to the hole he crawled out of." Melody Carter stood just inside the lobby, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes met Thomas's, and for a moment the storm outside faded. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She looked at him the way someone might look at a crumpled photo of an old friend, someone who had changed beyond recognition. "I thought I hated you," she said plainly, her voice a low hum. "But Blaze doesn't, and I trust him more than I trust most people." Thomas's lip trembled. "I didn't mean to—" "I know," she cut in. "That doesn't erase it, but it means something." Behind her, Nurse Irene Voss, short, sharp-eyed, with arms that looked stronger than her frame, stepped forward. She'd been Melody's second-in-command at the veterinary clinic since Melody arrived in Ash Creek. Irene wasn't one for words, but her glare said plenty as she brushed past Thomas and handed Melody a file. Luke watched from the hallway, then ducked into his office and made the call. The Billings Veterans Recovery Center was a secured psychological treatment facility 3 hours east, one of the best in Montana for trauma-related disorders. With the help of state records and military certifications Melody had submitted, Luke had drafted an emergency appeal for court-mandated treatment in lieu of pretrial detainment. Thomas would be under observation for 90 days. No freedom, no shortcuts. But a chance. By late afternoon, the streets outside the police station swelled. Protesters screamed. A few local business owners, like Roy Kemp, a wiry hardware shop owner with a scar running across his scalp from a chainsaw accident, threatened to shut down if the arsonist stayed in town. Melody stepped outside the clinic around 5 p.m. and found red paint splashed across the front window. Traitor lover. Someone had also shattered a flower pot by the door and left a burned toy dog atop the shards. Officer Nolan, the elderly patrolman with the ski limp, was already sweeping the glass when she arrived. "Folks have gone mad," he muttered. "Town's turned cold in more ways than weather." Back at the clinic, Blaze was resting in a padded crate lined with blankets. His right hind leg had been amputated 2 days prior due to infection. He was shaved, stitched, and covered in a thin layer of protective balm, but his eyes, those deep amber eyes, still sparkled when the door opened. Melody knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the fur under his chin. "Thomas is here," she whispered. "People want to hurt him." Blaze's ears perked. He tried to rise, stumbled, and instead dragged his front paws forward, straining toward the door. His body was weak, but the will unbroken. "Still loyal," Melody murmured, tears pooling. "After everything." Luke returned just after sundown, the snow having turned to sleet. He placed a copy of the signed transfer order on Melody's desk. "Thomas leaves for Billings at dawn, under guard. He'll be evaluated, treated, and monitored. No visitors for 30 days. Melody nodded. "It's not justice, but it's a start." Luke looked toward the back room where Blaze had fallen back asleep, chest rising slow and steady. "He never gave up on Thomas," he said. "No," Melody replied, "and neither should we." As the night deepened, the streets emptied. The anger simmered, but behind closed doors. Ash Creek would not forget. But perhaps, just perhaps, it might learn to forgive. The Ash Creek courthouse stood silent under the brittle glare of a winter sun, its old brick facade laced with frost like veins across a weary face. Inside, the air was tense, brittle as the icicles hanging from the eaves. The gallery was packed with townsfolk, some grim-faced, others curious, a few bitter and loud in their whispered judgments. The trial of Thomas Rayburn had begun, not one of guilt or innocence, but of mercy. Judge Abigail Whitmore presided over the hearing. A stately woman in her early 60s with ash-gray curls pulled tightly into a bun, she wore her black robe like armor. Her voice, though soft, carried authority, a tone weathered by 3 decades of small-town justice. "We are not here to determine whether a crime occurred," she reminded the room, "but whether redemption is possible, whether the man before us deserves a second chance." Thomas sat at the defense table, pale and gaunt in a navy suit 2 sizes too large. His hands trembled in his lap, but his gaze remained fixed. On the bench, on the future, on Blaze. Dr. Marcus Holloway, Thomas's psychiatrist from the Billings facility, was the first to speak. A lean black man in his late 40s, Dr. Holloway wore tortoiseshell glasses and a wool vest over his shirt and tie. His calm demeanor held a warmth that softened even the sharpest cross-examiners. Thomas Rayburn was a textbook case of complex post-traumatic stress, Holloway explained. Survivor's guilt, night terrors, dissociative episodes. But over 90 days, he has shown significant improvement. He is lucid, responsible, and, perhaps most importantly, remorseful, not performatively, deeply. The murmurs in the courtroom rose again, quickly silenced by Judge Whitmore's gavel. "And then," Holloway continued, "there is the dog." At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and Blaze entered. Melody Carter guided the wheelchair slowly, carefully. Blaze's missing hind leg made his frame lopsided, but he sat tall, coat brushed, bandages neat. His eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on Thomas. His ears lifted, his tail wagged. The sound was quiet but unmistakable, a soft thump, thump, thump against the floor, like a heartbeat finding rhythm. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Thomas broke. He covered his face and wept silently. Melody approached the stand. "I brought him not for sympathy," she said, "but because this dog, who had every reason to fear, chose not to. He remembers love, not pain." Luke stood next. In uniform, his presence carried the weight of moral authority Ash Creek still trusted. He spoke plainly, no dramatics. "I served in the same region as Thomas," Luke said. "Years ago, I was pinned in an ambush. Thought I was a goner. A K-9 saved me, dragged me behind a wall when my legs were shredded. I never knew his name. Until now." He pulled out a tattered photo, scanned from an old field report. It showed Blaze, younger, tail high, beside a soldier's boots. "That's him," Luke said. "That's Blaze. That's the dog who saved me. And this," he lifted a worn letter, "is from Tommy, Thomas's former teammate. He died by suicide, but not before writing this. He read aloud, "Thomas isn't a monster. He's a man trying to carry the broken pieces of everyone we lost. If you're reading this, it means I failed to hold on, but maybe he still can. Give him a reason to believe we weren't all ghosts." When Luke finished, silence fell. Even the judge sat back, her gavel untouched. In that pause, Melody stepped forward once more. "I want to propose something," she said. "I've seen what dogs can do for broken soldiers, and I've seen what broken soldiers can do for abandoned dogs. Let's not waste that." She cleared her throat. "I'd like to open a non-profit in Ash Creek, a PTSD treatment and canine rescue center. We'll call it Ash Creek Guardians. The idea is simple. Give veterans a chance to heal by training and caring for dogs like Blaze. And I want Thomas to be part of it, not as a free man, but as one working for redemption, with therapy, with structure, with responsibility." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, some skeptical, some moved. Judge Whitmore raised a hand. "This is not how our town usually handles justice," she said, "but perhaps justice should evolve with understanding." She looked at Thomas. "You're not free, Mr. Rayburn, but you are forgiven. You'll continue treatment under supervision and assist in this program under Ms. Carter's guidance. One misstep, and your second chance ends." Thomas swallowed hard. "I understand, Your Honor." As the gavel struck, Blaze let out a soft bark, just once, a punctuation mark in the silence, a vow. The first snow of December fell soft and steady over Ash Creek, blanketing the town in a hush that felt more sacred than silent. The old grain silo near the outskirts, once abandoned, rusted, and forgotten, now stood reborn. Its walls had been repainted with a mural, a silhouette of a soldier kneeling beside a German shepherd, both gazing toward the mountains. Above them, in bold white letters, were the words, "Ash Creek Guardians." Inside the newly opened rehabilitation center, warmth radiated from a crackling stone fireplace. Dozens had gathered, veterans, townspeople, volunteers, and local press, all there to witness what had once seemed impossible. A sanctuary born not just from charity, but from pain transformed into purpose. Blaze lay by the entrance, a red scarf tied gently around his neck. His fur had grown back in most places, though patches of scarring peeked through. He moved with a hobble, his missing hind leg compensated by muscle memory and quiet dignity. He was older now, 8, perhaps 9, but carried himself with the grace of something eternal. Thomas stood near the podium, dressed in a gray wool sweater and dark jeans, a laminated badge around his neck identifying him not as a patient, but as veteran mentor, canine unit. His posture was straighter, his eyes clearer, the lines of anguish on his face softened by time and therapy. He glanced at Blaze, then back at the crowd, his voice steady when he spoke. "I once thought fire would be my end," he said. "Turns out it was a beginning. Not because I deserved one, but because that dog over there refused to let me go." Applause followed. Not loud, but sincere. Beside him stood Melody Carter, her auburn hair tied back in a braid, wearing a green parka with dog hairs clinging to the sleeves. Her clinic had since partnered with Ash Creek Guardians, and she now served as both co-director and on-site medic. She smiled at Thomas as if watching a garden bloom from ash. Luke leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, a half-smile on his face. His badge now read Deputy Chief, and his reputation had grown beyond just the title. He was the bridge between the town's cautious heart and the truth it had taken months to accept. Healing sometimes comes in forms you don't expect. The room was filled with other faces, too. Men with distant eyes and shaking hands, women whose voices still trembled when doors slammed too loud. They had come here for therapy, for hope, or just for the silence only a dog's presence could bring. And Blaze was the one who walked beside them, sometimes limping, sometimes resting his head gently in their laps. He was their mirror, their proof that scars could mean survival. In a side room, a boy sat clutching a paper cup of cocoa, He couldn't have been more than 7, with shaggy blonde hair and a NASA patch sewn awkwardly onto his puffer jacket. His name was Caleb, and he was the son of Sergeant Mason Reed, an ex-Marine who had tried to take his own life 6 months prior. Caleb had been quiet all day, eyes wide but guarded. But when Blaze padded toward him, something shifted. The dog lowered his head, nose twitching, and gently nudged Caleb's leg. The boy froze, then reached out with trembling fingers. "He helped my dad," Caleb said softly, almost too quiet to hear. Melody turned, blinking back tears. "What did you say, sweetie?" Caleb looked up. "That dog saved my dad. He told me. Said the dog just laid beside him real quiet, till he stopped crying. Then he got up. He said Blaze helped him want to be here again." Silence fell like snowflakes, soft but undeniable. Thomas knelt beside the boy, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We don't always get to be heroes," he said gently, "but sometimes we can help someone else become one." Later that day, as the sun began to set, the crowd moved outside for a small memorial near the flagpole. A brass plaque had been embedded at the base, etched with the name Tommy Hawk Delaney. Melody read aloud a few lines from the last letter Tommy had written, his handwriting enlarged and framed beside the plaque. "If one of us makes it out, promise me you'll do something with that pain. Don't carry it, plant it. Let it grow into something that outlives us both." As the crowd bowed their heads, Blaze stood beside the plaque, one ear twitching, his breath visible in the cold. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared toward the woods beyond the center, the same woods where his journey had nearly ended, and where it had, in truth, begun again. Snow began to fall. No words were spoken, but in the quiet, something settled, a promise, a memory, a vow made not of sound, but of shared survival. Blaze turned his head just slightly, toward the horizon where the snow met the sky. His eyes, dark and gleaming, held a calm that needed no explanation. Not all stories end in tragedy. Some, if you're lucky, end with a tail wag in the cold, and the sound of footsteps not walking away, but walking forward. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with trumpets or lightning from the sky. Sometimes they limp through the snow on 3 legs, wearing scars like armor and still choosing to trust. Blaze was never just a dog. He was a quiet reminder that love doesn't give up when it gets burned, that grace can live in fur and silence, and that God still moves in this world, often through those the world has cast aside. So the next time you feel broken, forgotten, or too far gone, remember Blaze. And remember that healing can come in strange ways, through open hands, patient hearts, and creatures who forgive before we do. If this story touched something deep inside you, share it. Let someone else believe in second chances. Drop a comment below. Tell us the name of the animal who waited beside you when no one else did. And if you believe, like we do, that no soul should be left behind. Click subscribe for more true stories of redemption, courage, and the love that changes lives. May God bless you. You who have ever knelt beside something hurting. You who still believe there is goodness in this world. And if your heart whispers amen, let it be heard in the comments below. Amen.
"Stop crying, Sami. I told you not to wander off." Noreen's voice cracked through the frigid air, her breath fogging in desperate bursts. She wasn't shouting out of anger. She was shouting to stop herself from breaking. The trees were closing in black, crooked arms heavy with snow, holding silence like a threat. The boy had been missing for nearly 2 hours now, 7 years old, with shoes too thin for this kind of cold. And they were too deep into the northern slopes, too far from the cabin. The wind was changing directions, confused like a thing looking for someone to blame. Arif was the first to speak again. His lips were blue, but his voice was steady. "Noreen, it's not your fault we keep walking. He's moving, I know he is." Sami doesn't freeze easy. But she didn't respond. She just stared ahead, where the footprints ended, not covered. Just stopped, as if the child had been lifted, vanished. The kind of thing that breaks rules of the forest. And somewhere behind them, the dog-whined Loba wasn't even there. Dog, not really. A half-feral husky mix that had followed Arif back from the last search and rescue. She was skittish with strangers, took food from a distance, never let anyone touch her. But that morning, before they even realized Sami was Gone. She was already pacing in circles outside the cabin, ears low, tail stiff. She had known. Now, she stood still in the snow, staring off toward a gully that dipped sharply down where no child would go willingly. Then she darted silent, low to the ground, not waiting for the humans. And without a word, Noreen followed. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct, the kind that burns in a mother's bones. The descent was rough, full of icy thorns and narrow paths where only something small and determined could pass. But Noreen pushed through, her gloves torn and bleeding, her voice no longer shouting, just whispering his name like a prayer, "Sammy, please." Then she saw the first sign. A small red glove snagged on a bare branch. Still warm, Arif's hand closed over her shoulder. Looked down in the hollow, barely. Sheltered beneath a crooked rock ledge, Sami was curled into a ball. Not shivering, not crying, just resting. His cheek pressed against something soft and breathing. Loba wrapped around him. Fur bristled against the storm, but she wasn't alone. There was something else behind her. Not human, not dog, and it was watching them. Noreen couldn't move at first. Her eyes locked on the shape behind the dog, and her mind rejected it. Her body wanted to run to Sami, scoop him up, collapse with him in her arms, but something in her spine kept her frozen. It was the way Loba hadn't turned her head. She hadn't moved an inch since they saw her. As though holding a boundary, guarding both what was hers and what she couldn't explain. Arif stepped slightly in front of Noreen, one arm stretched out to slow her. His breath was shallow now. He had seen it to dot behind the curve of Loba's flank, just beneath the overhang of stone. Something crouched low. At first, it looked like another dog, but the color wasn't right. Too pale for the region, almost bone-colored in the snowlight, and it was too still. Its eyes glowed, not with menace but with something colder, unreadable. The forest around, it seemed to hush in recognition. Somi stirred then, groggy, blinking up at his mother with a dazed expression. "I wasn't scared," he whispered, his voice hoarse and dreamy. "She stayed with me the whole time." Both of them. Loba shifted, slightly, just enough to allow Sami to lift his head. Her fur was matted with ice along her back, yet she hadn't moved from her post, not once, not to lick her own wounds or shake the snow free. The boy had been her only concern, but that other thing, ... it didn't blink, it didn't flinch. Noreen's gaze met it, and in that one silent moment, she felt something, not a threat, but a boundary. It was there because of the child. It was still there because of the child, and it didn't want thanks. It wanted distance. Arif took a cautious step forward. Kneeling near Sami, he wrapped his scarf gently around the boy's neck and began rubbing his hands between his own to get warmth back. Loba growled low, not at Arif but at the silence. When the thing behind her finally stood, Noreen felt her stomach flip. It wasn't large, it wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was slender, wild, and unknown. It had long limbs and a tail too thin for any dog. Something ancient pulsed in its form, and its breath came in slow clouds. As it moved backward, melting into the pines without a sound, only then did Loba finally exhale a deep, almost sorrowful sound, like the end of a long vigil. Noreen rushed forward then, finally, collapsing beside her son. She touched his face. He was cold but not frostbitten. He was pale but alert. There were no scratches, no bruises. Dust snow-caked on his boots, his pants soaked through, and yet, no panic, not even fear. Somi wrapped his arms around her neck, and whispered into her collar, "They didn't let the wind get me. Loba and the quiet one. They stayed until you came." It was the way he said it, with complete trust. As if it had all made sense to him, as if he had accepted the forest's strange terms without resistance. And perhaps that's why he'd survived. Arif scanned the tree line for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing now. Just branches whispering with returning wind. Loba nuzzled Sami's hand once, then backed away. She didn't follow them when they left. She didn't even look back. The climb back to the ridge was brutal. Noreen carried Sami half the way, Arif clearing the trail. Snow had started to fall again. Slow, heavy flakes, like the forest was reclaiming what it had briefly revealed. No words were spoken about what they saw. None of it would sound sane outside those trees. At the cabin, under heavy blankets and by the fire, Sami finally fell asleep. Noreen sat beside him, holding his fingers as if afraid they'd disappear. Arif stood at the window, eyes scanning the distant tree line. "Do you think it was injured?" she asked quietly. "I don't think it was that kind of creature," he replied. Noreen frowned. "Do you think it saved him?" "I think it guarded him." Loba did the saving, and why would it help? Arif didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because the boy never feared it." And it must have remembered what that felt like. Later that night, when the storm truly set in and the trees moaned with snow load, Noreen stepped outside briefly to breathe. The wind caught her hair, and the cold bit through her sleeves. But there, at the tree line, something faint moved just once. A pale figure, watching, not approaching, just present. And then it was gone. She didn't wake Arif, she didn't call out. She simply whispered a single word into the darkness: "Thank you." Inside, the fire crackled, and Sami stirred under the wool. One hand still outstretched in sleep, reaching toward a shape that had once kept him safe in the storm. The shape of a dog. and something older still. The storm had quieted, but only slightly enough that the sound of crunching snow returned to the forest. Not peaceful crunching, but the kind that comes with every nerve alert, every step braced for something you cannot name. Noreen could hardly feel her legs anymore. Her boots were soaked through, her knees stiff from stumbling, but her eyes never left the small form tucked beneath the rock ledge. Sami hadn't moved. Loba growled, low and guttural, not at the humans approaching, but at the shape just beyond her flank. Arif couldn't see it clearly. It blended too well into the cold and the white and the shadows, but it moved with weight. Not in a threatening charge, not yet. It paced, observed, and then it let out a sound, not quite a growl, not a howl. Either it was something heavier, a warning soaked in sorrow. Noreen stepped forward before Arif could stop her, half kneeling by Sami's side. She reached for his cheek, numb fingers shaking as she cupped the boy's face. He stirred, and her breath caught. He blinked slowly, then looked up. "Mama, the dog kept me warm." Tears came then, hot and sudden and sharp. She pulled him into her arms, wrapping herself around him like she was trying to shield him from the entire world. But Arif's attention had shifted. He could see the shape more clearly now, and his mind struggled to make sense of what he was looking at. It was a wolf. At least, that's what the shape suggested. But not the kind that wandered alone, or hunted silently through pines. This one was larger than any he'd seen, coat patchy with age, one eye clouded white, and a limp in its back leg that made its movements stilted and hesitant. It didn't snarl, it didn't approach, it only sat back as if guarding or grieving. Then he saw it. Behind the wolf, barely covered by a thin sheet of snow, lay another smaller shape, still, lifeless, a pup, likely no more than a few months old. And suddenly, everything made sense. Loba hadn't been alone because she'd found the boy. She hadn't just protected Sami, she'd brought him here. To them, Noreen followed his gaze and gasped softly. That's why she came this way. She knew, Arif murmured. She was leading him to shelter, and to them, for a long suspended moment, none of them moved. The wind whispered through the branches above, delicate and cold, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and death and something older like memory. Sami stirred again in her arms, his voice dry and cracked. The big dog didn't growl, she just watched. She let me lie down next to Loba, then she howled once. That's all she... Arif asked. Sami nodded. She was sad. The old wolf made no move to leave. She simply looked at them. Not with hunger, not with fear, but with an understanding so deep it sent chills through Arif's spine. It was not an animal reacting to danger. It was a mother sitting vigil. And then, slowly, she limped forward, just enough to close the gap between herself and the small dead pup. She lay down beside it, curled around it the way Loba had curled around Sami, and closed her eyes. The growl was gone now. All that remained was breath. Shallow, slow, resigned. "We can't stay here," Arif whispered. "But we can't carry them both," Noreen said. "Not with this slope, and I can't leave her. Not like this." Loba stood suddenly, shook out her coat, then stepped toward the old wolf. She nuzzled her once firmly, with intention, and then turned to Arif and barked. Once, a short, commanding sound, as if telling him, "Move now." It took them 2 hours to get back to the trail ridge, and another hour beyond that to find the search party. They moved slowly, Arif carrying Sami in his arms, Noreen at his side, with Loba never straying more than a few feet away. None of them spoke much. The cold wasn't the enemy anymore. It was the silence that hurt most. The silence left behind by what they couldn't take with them. By the time the rescue team wrapped Sami in thermal blankets and called in the chopper, the storm had returned, soft this time, like the forest was covering its secrets again. One of the rangers tried to praise Loba, but she backed away, tail low, and disappeared into the tree line before anyone could stop her. They never saw her again. But months later, when the snow had melted and the forest paths were dry, Noreen returned alone. She climbed back down into that same gully, not out of need, but something closer to death, and what she found was quiet and peaceful. There were no bodies, no bones, only a hollow where the snow had once gathered, and a patch of fur caught on a branch, soft and gray and speckled with white, a sign, a farewell. She placed a flat stone beside the hollow, nothing carved, no name, just a weight to mark that something had mattered there. Then she sat down on the earth, closed her eyes and whispered thank you. The wind had shifted again, sharper now. It dragged the cold straight through Arif's coat and into his ribs like a warning. He hadn't spoken since they'd pulled Sami up from the hollow, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them all was heavier than words. Noreen was cradling her son, rubbing his hands in hers. Sami had opened his eyes, but they were glazed, dreamy, as if he hadn't quite returned from wherever his mind had gone in the storm. And Loba wasn't near him anymore. She stood at the edge of the clearing, body rigid, ears flattened, staring into the trees, not barking, not growling, just fixed, as though she was listening to something none of them could hear, or if followed her gaze. Whatever had been behind Loba in that rocky hollow, that shape in the snow shadow, that low broad silhouette was no longer there, but its presence hadn't left. There were prints, huge ones, too wide to be canine, too fluid in stride to be a bear. They trailed away through the underbrush like the path of a ghost dragged sideways across the land. And in the center of the print, something dark. Blood. Arif squatted down. It was warm. Noreen's voice cut across the clearing, hoarse and low, like her throat was full of gravel. He said something about her not being alone. Arif turned. What do you mean? Noreen looked down at her son. Sami was murmuring, in broken half-sentences, his small voice barely audible. The dog came back with another ... not like her. Big eyes ... quiet. Hallucination, Arif said too quickly, almost to himself. Kids see things when they're that cold, but Loba hadn't moved. And the moment Noreen stood to face her, Loba took a single step back into the trees. Then another. She wants us to follow, Noreen whispered. Arif grabbed her arm. No, we've got Sami. We go back. Call for evac. But Noreen didn't answer. She just knelt and whispered something into Sami's ear, something Arif couldn't hear, then handed the boy over to him, slow and deliberate. You take him. I won't go far, Noreen. I have to know. Loba was already gone. The wood swallowed her. Noreen followed. Every step she took into the frostbitten forest felt like entering a dream too vivid to be safe. The air smelled wrong, not of death, not of rot, something older. Wet bark and cold iron. The trail was marked now not by Loba's tracks alone but by something else. Tufts of fur snagged on branches, strange indentations in the snow, not clawed, not hooved, round, as if padded, but too large and oddly spaced, and then, a sound, a whimper. Not Loba, not human, a cry low and rhythmic, like a breath trapped in sorrow. Noreen ducked under a branch and came into another clearing, this one unnaturally still. Loba sat in the center, but this time she wasn't guarding anyone. She was waiting, and just beyond her, nestled between two boulders, was what Noreen could only describe later as a den, but not a normal one. Not dug, not made. It was formed by nature, but shaped by hands or something close to them. Branches woven over stone. Inside movement, then she saw it. A second creature, not a dog, not even a wolf. Its fur was silvered with frost, its body long and low, like an ancient canine, but its eyes were human-wide, round, and terribly calm. It looked straight at her without flinching. There was no fear, no threat, only an unbearable, watchful sorrow. And curled beside it were pups, not all the same. Some looked like Loba's kind, narrow-muzzled fur, thick and brown. But one, smaller than the rest, had eyes that matched the creature. The wide-eyed one. Loba stepped closer to Noreen, then sat again, gaze flicking between her and the den. A quiet request. Noreen knelt. You weren't alone. Loba blinked. She had brought her child back, but she had left something behind. This was her second family. The silence was broken by a crack, a gunshot in the distance. Human voices, distant but getting closer. Rescue, maybe. Rangers. Loba turned sharply toward the sound, then looked back at Noreen. There was no panic in her, only urgency. And Noreen understood. She rose slowly, backed away from the den. She didn't speak, just nodded once, chest heavy with a truth she hadn't been ready for. This wasn't just a rescue, it had been a trade. One lost child returned, one secret left untouched. By the time Arif found her again, breath ragged and fury fading to relief, she was already walking back, eyes fixed ahead. She's not coming back with us, she said softly. Arif didn't argue. He looked once into the trees, where no tracks remained, and pulled Sami closer against his chest. Loba's shape vanished behind the trees. Swallowed by the cold and the bond of blood, one family found, the other left to the silence of the mountains. They didn't speak again until the cabin lights flickered in the distance. The snow had thickened by morning, not in a violent way, just steady, patient, as if the forest was slowly covering its own memories. Noreen sat beside the fire, Sami asleep under 3 wool blankets. His breaths, shallow, but even the ranger team had come in the early hours, bringing thermal wraps, questions, and quiet disbelief when they saw the child alive, limbs unbroken, pulse intact. No one asked too many questions about how he'd survived that long in the cold, and no one noticed that Loba wasn't there. Rare watched from the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. When the others left the room, he finally stepped forward. They'll want to know more. They'll say it doesn't add up. A child alone in the snow for 8 hours. No frostbite, no trauma. He paused, looking down at Sami's sleeping face. You and I both know he wasn't alone. Noreen didn't answer. She stirred the fire, her hand trembling just slightly. In her mind she could still see those wide eyes behind the branches, the den, the silence, Loba standing there. It split between 2 worlds, and the unspoken choice she'd made. It wasn't just survival, she said after a long while. It was protection. It was something deeper. She didn't lead us to him so she could return with us. She led us there so we could understand. Arif knelt beside her. You think that creature was what? Some kind of ancestor? Something ancient? I don't know, she whispered, but I know this. It loved her, and she trusted it. That's more truth than any answer we'll get. They both fell into silence again. letting the fire crackle and fill the space with warmth that felt earned. Sami stirred once, murmuring something that sounded like her eyes were kind. Then he turned and settled deeper into the blankets. By noon, the rescue crew had cleared out. A helicopter had arrived, but Sami didn't need evacuation. The doctor's words were baffled but clear. Stable, no hypothermia, just sleep-deprived. A miracle, they said. Noreen just nodded. Outside, the snow was undisturbed. No paw prints, no tracks. But when Arif walked to the edge of the clearing to light a cigarette, he stopped suddenly. There, on the lowest branch of a pine, hung a single piece of red yarn, frayed damp, a torn thread from Sami's winter hat. It hadn't been there yesterday. He didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long time, until the cigarette burned down between his fingers. Then he went back inside. Later that night, as they packed to leave the cabin, Noreen paused at the threshold and looked back at the woods. The trees were quiet, the shadows deep. Somewhere out there, a family remained untouched by the world's explanations. She gave him back, she said softly, because she knew we'd understand. And with that they left the mountain behind. Snow kept falling, and somewhere deep within those woods, beyond the hollow and the woven den, a low cry echoed once a mother's call, answered by silence, then soft footfalls moving deeper into the dark.